Good morning, this is Nicole Ringgold. Today I'm going to show you how to bezel set an odd shaped piece without using glue. Here you'll see I have a handful of claws. They're of a black bear that no, I did not hunt myself. But I've been commissioned to bezel set one of these. Other examples of irregular shaped bezel settings could be elk ivory, shark teeth, antlers, etc. As always, thank you to Rio Grande for sponsoring my YouTube channel. You can see the discount code down in the description of this tutorial. If you happen to have claws, you will want to fill them with epoxy so they have a little bit more weight to them. But if you just have elk ivory or shark's teeth, you don't need that. So here is the epoxy. Of course, be sure to read the instructions on the box. It's going to be 50% of A, resin, and 50% of B. You'll want to mix it really well. And then so the first is a resin and the second is the hardener. 50% of each. Stir it and then you'll pour it into the cavity. And it'll take about 24 hours to dry. I place mine upright, just like that, and wait one whole day. Once the epoxy is dry, you can use a coarse fiber wheel. That's the Rio code, order code. And I use it to take off, if you see that the sides of the claws or whatever it is that you're bezel setting are bubbling or peeling, I use this to smooth out the surface. You can also use this coarse fiber wheel to remove any of the epoxy that may have dripped onto the side of your piece. You may prefer to have your piece glossy or high sheen. I prefer to use Renaissance wax. This protects your piece, and then it has a matte or flat finish, not too shiny. I use my clean fingers or a cotton swab to take the Renaissance wax and rub it all through, trying to blend together any of the blemishes. I apply the Renaissance wax before I begin working on the piece and again at the very end. This ensures that it has several layers, and then you may just have to reapply on occasion. I've also read that you can use bag balm, which is basically lanolin, and it's possible that Vaseline or petroleum jelly could work. So then I'm going to use a Sharpie, and I'm going to mark exactly where I want my bezel to rest against the bear claw. I want to be sure to cover the openings on either side so that those are hidden. But I want to keep exposed as much as the bear claw, the front face and the back face of the bear claw. So I'm going to create a curved bezel setting. Then I'm going to translate that curvature to a piece of paper. I'm going to start by putting a mark on either side of where I want the bezel setting to rest. And then I'm going to fold the piece of paper around the bear claw. Remove the claw, and then you're going to take the piece of paper and fold it once again. So basically it's going to be folded in fours. Go across that line, make sure it's nice and clean, and then you're going to draw in the rest of the bezel setting. So you're going to draw where you want your silver to be. I'm measuring it against the claw just to be sure I have the curve right, and then I'm going to color in exactly where I want my silver to be. And then from here you'll cut out that piece of paper. Once you've cut it out, unfold it, and then you can use some sort of glue. I use rubber cement, and then I paste it to 24 gauge sterling silver sheet. And while you're waiting for this to dry, for the glue to dry, you can twiddle your thumbs. Or if you're wondering what kind of saw blade to use for 24 gauge sheet, you can either download a chart from Rio Grande, or I have one from Green Lion Saw Frame that I put on my desk and refer to it as often as I need to. This nifty chart shows you, so here are the gauges, and there are a variety of options for 24 gauge sheet. So you're probably going to want to go with somewhere in the middle, like a 6/0 saw blade. It's also a chart that tells you what size drills to use if you're needing to do so to put wire through which we'll refer to this later. Anyway, so here I am sawing out the 24 gauge sheet. The piece of paper is my template. I'm using a 6/0 soft blade. And just be sure, one tip for sawing is to not clamp your hand super hard, rigidly around your saw frame. You want to treat it like it's a bird, and you don't want to choke your bird to death. If you relax your hand around the saw frame, then it will relax your arm all the way up into your neck, and your neck won't cramp. Peel off the paper. I like to keep mine, set it aside just in case I need it for later, just in case I screw up. Use your fingers to rub off any remaining glue. Now I'm going to anneal the sheet because it's dirty and brittle. To do so, I have a Little Smith oxygen propane torch, and here I've got about 3 inches of propane to start out with. As you can see, that's about 3 inches, I think. Adding my oxygen, so I'm going to, that would be a normal soldering flame or fusing. Beautiful light blue, slightly rounded. I'm going to add propane to soften the flame, and having a softer flame like that coaxes the fine silver to the surface. And I'm heating the silver until when I pull away, it's nice and dark. If this is a new concept for you, you can refer to my entire tutorial on how to use the Little Smith torch. I walk you through everything there. I've pickled, I've quenched, and now I've folded the seam over, and I'm going to solder the top of the seam. Here I'm fluxing. I use Mighty Flux Grande. And I'm going to solder the top of the seam with hard solder. I use wire solder. I prefer it just because I think it's easier to pick solder with. So here I'm going to snip my hard solder, and then I'm going to use my pick to place the solder on top of the seam while I'm heating below. Heating, waiting for my flux to foam. There's my solder on my pick. Heating the piece until I see, I don't know if you can see that, it's a slight yellow hue, which means solder flow point. Oops, I dropped my solder. Heating my piece, and then I can go directly below the seam or to the seam, and it will go straight across. I have these miniature stakes made by Frets, really nifty and quite expensive. If you don't have this set, you can use dapping pins or some other kind of mandrel, and you can put it in your vise. It works just as effectively. With the miniature stake set, I try to find a stake that mimics the shape that I'm trying to ultimately accomplish. And on the side that's not soldered, I want to be sure that I am closing it together and that it's nice and flush. I'm using a nylon mallet. Before I go and solder the other side together, I want to be sure that the bezel fits around my bear claw. I also want to ensure that the seam is flush, and if it's not, I'll move over to use some files. As you can see, it's got a tiny gap right there, so I'm going to have to use files. And of course, there are so many different types of files, but here I'm just going to file gently until that seam is completely flush, and then I can solder it shut. So this looks pretty good. Now I'm going to flux the piece, and again I'm going to use hard solder. I'm using my third hand. You don't want to put too much pressure on it so it squeezes it shut or makes it go a little bit off center. So I'm just putting a little pressure on that to hold it shut. I used hard solder because it's far away enough from the original seam. And then once again, you're going to want to make sure that it fits your bear claw. This looks pretty good. There's a little bit of a gap on one side right there. that I'm going to try to grind down a little bit. Here I'm using, these are separating discs or cutoff wheels. I'm going to use those to smooth out the edges of the bezel. I'm also going to sand down the corners, try to get rid of any of the solder that may have puddled on either side of the seams. And from here, I'll move over to varying grits of sandpaper to smooth everything out. I'm also sanding down the top side of the bezel to ensure that it's nice and flat so that I can put a cap on it without having any gaps. I'm using the coarse fiber wheel again then to brush off the Sharpie. It never hurts to check one more time to be sure that your bezel fits your piece exactly how you want it before you proceed. Okay, so now it's time to put on the cap. I like to solder from below, so I use this titanium, it's called a Tie Quad by Lion Punch Forge. Super sweet miniature titanium platform, and you can put your piece on top, and that allows you to heat from below. And since it's titanium, it doesn't act as like much of a heat sink. Fluxing the top and the bottom. This is 22 gauge sheet. Also fluxing my bezel setting. It's funny because it kind of looks like a big bathtub when it's upright. Then I'll put medium solder all along the inside of the bezel, right up against the seam. In the last tutorial I provided, somebody asked me to provide information on how much propane I start with. So for this particular project, I'm starting with approximately 4 inches, 3.5, 4 inches of propane before I start adding my oxygen. I don't know if you can see that, but now that I've added my oxygen, do you see how my torch is a little bit yellow? That's just dirt inside my torch tip, so I'll have to clean that out. Anyway, so I'm heating the entire thing, waiting for the flux to foam. I'm heating the entire mass, and then once the foam starts to dissipate, I can move, if my solder has moved, move it with my pick back to the seams, and then heat from below, until your solder flows. There's the yellow, that solder flow point. I just turned my torch up a little bit. Solder flow point, heating the mass, continuing to solder from below until the solder flows. And there it's done. I'm gonna pickle, quench, and now because it's 22 gauge sheet, I'm using a 3/0 saw blade. Again, you can refer to your chart. Sawing around the bezel, keeping my saw frame or the saw blade upright, not at an angle, because I don't want to saw into the piece below. Go back to the sandpaper, different grits, and sand down the edges of the sheet that you basically soldered. It looks so much like a bathtub to me. This next step is optional. This is 20 gauge wire that I'm wrapping around. It's really going to be the top of the bezel, although it looks like the bottom since it does look like a bathtub. Snipping with my flush cutters by Lindstrom. And here I've got hard solder, starting with about an inch and a half of propane, adding my oxygen, and then I'm going to pick my hard solder and go back and forth across the seam until my solder flows into the gap. Not the gap, into the seam. And I'll switch over to easy solder, probably use about 5 pieces of solder, and I'm gonna sweat them to the wire. What that means is that I'm turning on my torch, picking up the solder, and I'm going to heat the wire until it's hot enough to transfer the solder over to the wire. And then I'm going to go back and I'm going to make sure that the solder on the wire is puddled. That's called sweat soldering. That way, I can transfer the wire to the bathtub and then just heat the mass, the tub, without worrying about placement of the solder. Putting the bezel setting, the bathtub, into the wire, make sure that it's sitting down flush on your soldering platform. And for those of you who don't know this, my soldering platform is called Silquar, S-I-L-Q-U-A-R. I get it from Rio Grande, although I think Peppy Tools also sells it. Okay, 2 inches of propane to start, add my oxygen, and then now I'm going to heat the mass. I'm going to avoid the wire. I'm going to avoid torching the wire directly. I'm heating only the largest piece of the silver. And then I'm watching for the colors to change. And you can't really see it here, but there is a slight yellow hue, and that means solder flow point. So I'm going around and heating the mass, and the solder from the wire is flowing. I also provided a tutorial on all these different texturing capabilities with rotary tools, so you might want to revisit that for this. But anyway, I'm using this particular texture is used with my polishing wheel, and it creates a beautiful sanded type texture all along. If you're afraid of holding this with your fingers, you can hold it with pliers instead. And then that way you can avoid all types of possible injuries. And be sure to wear protective lenses. You need to wear glasses. So here, see if I can get it. There's the texture, really pretty. And you can hold that piece with your pliers. And as you might have noticed, I actually put 2 pieces of wire around my bezel, and it's the same process for both pieces of wire. Put the bear claw back in the bezel setting, and then you're going to use a Sharpie to mark exactly where you want to drill holes. This is a drill bit for 16 gauge wire. Refer to your chart for that number. And I'm drilling through the metal, the claw, the epoxy, and through the metal on the opposite end. The holes go all the way through. I'm setting that aside now, and here are 3 pieces of, I don't know, about 1.5 inches, 16 gauge wire, and I'm going to solder them together with hard solder. They're fluxed, there's the hard solder. I'm going to heat my mass here, move over, pick up my solder, heat your solder, not your pick, and make sure your pick is clean. Transferring the solder over to the mass, and then I'm going to heat the mass until the solder flows. Pickle, quench. Now I'm going to take this little threesome and wrap it over or bend it over my round nose pliers. Snip off or saw off the ends. You're going to want to make sure it sits well on your piece, that it reaches both sides. And here I've got easy solder on my platform, and I'm going to sweat them to the bottom of each side of this U-shaped bale. There's my solder. Picking up the solder and sweating it just to the ends. I'll use my third hand to hold the bale in place. And then again, you're going to want to flux your entire piece. And then you'll heat the mass, not the bale, heat the mass, and that will draw the solder from the bale down to the mass. Because always remember, solder follows heat. Solder follows heat. Solder follows heat. Hopefully that's now drilled into your head. Once that's done, polish it up, sand it down, polish it up. And here I'm going to paint on my liver of sulfur, because either your liver of sulfur needs to be hot to be effective, or your piece. Then I'm going to take 2 pieces of 16 gauge round wire, and I'm going to hold them with my tweezers. You can also use your tongs or cross-locking tweezers that are insulated if you're worried about the heat. I'm turning my torch up to a nice hot temperature, and I'm going to ball up one side of each of the 2 wires. Slip the bear claw back in the bezel, make sure that the holes line up, and then you'll poke the 2 wires all the way through. From here you have a couple of options. If you don't want to use heat and do a cold connection, that's fine. You'll snip the wire very close to the bezel setting and then use a riveting hammer. Or else you can do what I'm going to show you here. I'm going to turn on my torch, and it's going to be a very hot flame. This is a size 6 torch tip, and I'm probably using about 6 inches of propane, adding my oxygen. I'm not pointing down at my piece, not like that. I'm pointing across with the torch. I'm probably going to burn the wax layer just a little bit, which is okay, but I'm using my pick as a sink, a heat sink. I'm going directly across and balling that wire. It did burn just a little bit, but that's okay. Then here I'm using the coarse fiber wheel again to remove some of the liver of sulfur. Then I'm using a yellow sunburst radial disc to remove more of it. I'm also trying to work on that wax, but it's not quite effective. So after I'm done with the sunburst radial disc, I'm going to use a brass brush. What I love about the radial discs is how it leaves some of the liver of sulfur, but it really shines up the silver beautifully. Once I'm done here, again, as I said, I'm going to use a brass brush to remove the scorched wax. And then I'm going to reapply the Renaissance wax. Again, you'll want to make sure that your fingers are clean to do that if you're using your hands to rub it in, or you can use a cotton swab. And that's it. As always, don't hesitate to reach out with questions, comments. I hope that this was helpful for you and gave you a little bit of insight. Thank you. Have a wonderful weekend.